March 4, 1944, 0600 hours. Royal Air Force Debden, Essex, England.
Staff Sergeant Glessner Webicher stood beneath the left wing of a P-51 Mustang, observing his pilot prepare for a sortie deeper into Germany than any single-engine fighter had ever attempted. The pilot was Captain Dominic Gentile, 23 years old, a former Royal Air Force Eagle Squadron veteran, son of Italian immigrants from Piqua, Ohio. In 6 hours, Gentile would be flying to Berlin, covering more than 1,100 miles round-trip, escorting B-17 bombers to the heart of the Nazi capital.
If everything went flawlessly, he might survive.
Webicher had served as a crew chief with the 4th Fighter Group's 336th Fighter Squadron for 18 months.
He knew aircraft maintenance thoroughly.
He understood what these machines could handle and where their limits lay.
The P-51 Mustang before him was unlike anything the U.S. Air Force had ever deployed.
Single-engine fighter, capable of agile rolls, powered by a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, sleek laminar flow wings, fast and lethal at high altitude. But what made this aircraft revolutionary was not its speed or climb rate. It was something far simpler. You could fly to Berlin and back without running out of fuel.
No other American fighter could manage that, not the P-38 Lightning, not the P-47 Thunderbolt, only the Mustang.
The challenge was that no one had yet proven it. This would be the first attempt. And if it failed, if the fuel estimates were incorrect, if the drop tanks malfunctioned, if anything went wrong, dozens of pilots would run out of fuel over Germany and perish. American bomber crews had been dying for 18 months.
Good men, thousands of them, young men, really.
They climbed into their B-17s with confidence and returned in coffins or did not return at all. The 8th Air Force attributed the problem to German fighters. The enemy was too strong, too aggressive, too numerous. American doctrine insisted bombers could defend themselves with massed firepower, fly in tight formations, concentrate your defensive guns.
German fighters could not break through.
The manuals claimed it worked. The statistics said otherwise. On August 17, 1943, 376 B-17 Flying Fortresses attacked the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg and the ball bearing plants at Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany, beyond the reach of P-47 Thunderbolt escorts.
The bombers went in alone. The Luftwaffe was waiting.
They struck the American formations the moment the escorts turned back.
Wave after wave of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s tore into the bomber groups.
Head-on attacks at closing speeds of 600 miles per hour. Cannon fire ripped through cockpits and wings.
Bombers detonated mid-air. Crews bailed out over occupied territory. 60 bombers were lost that day. Over 500 crewmen, 50 missing. Every one of those aircraft had adhered to doctrine perfectly.
Tight formation, concentrated defensive fire, everything by the book.
They died anyway. The second Schweinfurt raid came 2 months later, October 14, 1943.
Black Thursday. The 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17s back to the same target.
They had rebuilt their strength, trained replacement crews, refined their tactics. It did not matter. The Luftwaffe shot down 60 more bombers.
650 men killed, wounded, or missing, a loss rate exceeding 20% on a single mission. The 8th Air Force lost air superiority over Germany that day. They could not sustain such losses.
Aircraft and crews could not be replaced fast enough. Deep penetration raids into Germany were suspended until a solution could be found.
The bomber offensive, the entire strategy of forcing Nazi Germany to its knees through strategic bombing, was faltering. Not due to poor tactics, not due to inadequate training, but because American fighters could not escort bombers all the way to the targets and back. The P-47 Thunderbolt was an excellent aircraft, rugged, heavily armed, capable of absorbing tremendous damage and returning pilots home. But it had a combat radius of less than 400 miles with internal fuel. With external drop tanks, maybe 550 miles, Berlin lay 600 miles from England.
The numbers did not add up. The P-38 Lightning had the range theoretically.
Twin engines, twin fuselage booms, ample internal fuel capacity, but production was limited, and most of the planes were allocated to the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters. The 8th Air Force in England never had enough, and the P-38 struggled at high altitude in Europe's cold weather, engine failures, control issues, pilots freezing in the cockpit. It was not the solution. What the 8th Air Force needed was a fighter that could fly to Berlin, engage the Luftwaffe over the target, and return to England.
A fighter that could accompany bombers for the entire mission.
A fighter that combined range, speed, altitude performance, and firepower.
That fighter did not exist in 1943.
Then, in November, the 354th Fighter Group received the first P-51 Mustangs in England. The Mustang had existed since 1942, initially powered by an Allison V1710 engine. Early Mustangs were good low-altitude fighters, used by the RAF for ground attacks and reconnaissance, but they were inadequate at 20,000 to 30,000 feet, where bomber battles took place. The Allison engine could not produce enough power in thin air.
The breakthrough came when a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was installed in the Mustang airframe. The Merlin featured a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that provided outstanding high-altitude performance.
The combination of the Mustang's aerodynamic design and the Merlin's power created something remarkable. At 30,000 feet, the P-51B could reach 440 miles per hour, outclimb German fighters, and outmaneuver them at high speed.
With external drop tanks, it could reach any destination.
Colonel Donald Blakesley recognized the potential immediately.
Blakesley commanded the 4th Fighter Group at Debden.
He was 26, one of the most experienced American fighter pilots in Europe.
He had flown with the RAF Eagle squadrons before the U.S. entered the war and fought the Luftwaffe since 1941. By January 1944, he had over 800 combat hours.
He knew what worked and what did not. Blakesley despised the P-47 Thunderbolt. Too large, too heavy, too limited in range. His pilots were dying because they could not accompany bombers deep into Germany. When Blakesley first saw the P-51 Mustang in December 1943, he knew this aircraft could change the war.
He flew 6 missions with the 354th Fighter Group to evaluate the Mustang and returned convinced. On January 1, 1944, Blakesley took command of the 4th Fighter Group. His first priority, acquiring Mustangs.
He presented his case to Major General William Kepner, commander of the 8th Fighter Command. The P-51 could escort bombers to any target in Germany, engage enemy fighters on equal or superior terms, fly higher and faster than any Luftwaffe aircraft. Kepner was skeptical. Converting one of England's premier fighter groups to a new aircraft meant weeks offline for pilot training.
Blakesley promised, "Give me the Mustangs, and the group would be combat ready in 24 hours. Kepner agreed.
The first P-51s arrived at Debden on February 28, 1944.
Blakesley personally flew the lead aircraft.
The ground crews immediately began inspecting engines, loading ammunition, and installing drop tanks. Pilots received minimal familiarization. Most had under an hour in the Mustang before their first combat sortie, some as little as 40 minutes. There was no time for extensive training.
The bombers needed escorts now.
Captain Dominic Gentile had been with the 4th Fighter Group since September 1942, when the Eagle squadrons transferred to the U.S. Army Air Forces. He was a natural aviator. As a teenager in Ohio, his father had purchased him a plane, and Gentile logged over 300 hours before joining the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1941. He flew Spitfires with 133 Eagle Squadron, claiming 2 victories before the transfer. He had flown P-47s for over a year, scoring 4 more kills. But Gentile, like all Eagle Squadron veterans, preferred the Merlin engine. The Spitfire had a Merlin, now the Mustang had a Merlin.
It felt like coming home. Gentile had maybe an hour in the Mustang before the Berlin mission briefing.
He was a skilled pilot, experienced, aggressive. He and his wingman, John Godfrey, were already gaining fame as the most effective fighter team in the 8th Air Force. Winston Churchill would later call them
the Damon and Pythias of the 20th century. But the Mustang was different from anything Gentile had flown. It's handled differently.
The controls felt lighter.
The visibility was better with the bubble canopy. Everything about it required adjustment. 1 hour was not enough time to become proficient. It would have to do. On the evening of
March 3, the 4th Fighter Group received the mission briefing.
The target was Berlin. Over 800 B-7 and B-24 bombers would attack German aircraft factories in and around the capital.
The mission required fighter escort for the
entire route, inbound and outbound, over 600 miles each way.
The 4th Fighter Group would provide part of that escort, joining the bomber stream over central Germany and staying with them through the target area.
The briefing room went silent when the intelligence officer pulled the curtain back from the mission map.
A red line stretched from Debden
across the English Channel, across Holland, across northern Germany, all the way to Berlin. No American single-engine fighter had ever flown that far into Germany.
Most of the pilots in that room had never been past the Rhine River. Berlin was 300 miles beyond that, deep in the heart of Nazi Germany, the most heavily defended city in Europe.
The key to the mission was fuel management. Each P-51B carried 184 gallons of fuel in internal wing tanks and an 85 gallons fuselage tank behind the cockpit. That
was enough for maybe 400 m of combat radius.
But each Mustang would also carry 2 external drop tanks under the Wings, 108-gallon capacity each.
Paper construction made in England by companies that normally manufactured
cardboard boxes.
These tanks would give the Mustang an additional 216 gallons of fuel, enough to extend range to over 750 miles.
The fuel management sequence was critical. Take off on internal wing fuel. Climb to altitude using wing fuel in the fuselage tank. Switch to drop tanks after crossing into occupied Europe.
Burn the drop tanks completely before reaching the combat area.
Drop the empty tanks. Fight on internal fuel only. Return to England on whatever fuel remained. If any step failed, if the
drop tanks did not feed properly, if pilots switched tanks at the wrong time, if fuel consumption was higher than calculated, pilots would run out of fuel over Germany and die.
Gentile studied the mission profile carefully that evening. The Mustang's fuselage tank affected the aircraft's center of gravity when full. The manual said not to engage in combat with fuel in the fuselage tank. The aircraft would be tail-heavy and difficult to maneuver.
You had to burn the fuselage tank first, then the drop tanks, then the wing
tanks. Miss that sequence, and you might win the dogfight, but run out of fuel on the way home. Get it right and you had a chance. Staff Sergeant Wetbucker worked on Gentile's aircraft through the night.
The Mustang was mechanically
sound.
The Merlin engine ran perfectly. The guns were bore-sighted and loaded with 400 rounds per gun for the 50
caliber machine guns and 200 rounds for the 20 mm cannon. The drop tanks were installed and tested. The fuel system checked out. Everything was ready.
But Weiser had been a crew chief long enough to know that everything being ready did
not mean everything would go right. He had watched too many pilots fly out on perfect aircraft and not come back. The
bomber crews called Germany the most dangerous place on Earth. And now fighter pilots would be flying 1,100 miles deep into that hell in single
engine aircraft that could not survive a single bullet in the cooling system. Wickbacker said nothing. He signed off
the maintenance log and watched the sun rise over the airfield. At 0530 hours on March 4, the pilots began their pre-flight briefing.
Weather over Germany would be clear. Visibility unlimited. The Luftwaffe would be up in force. Intelligence estimated 200 German fighters would intercept, maybe more. Tactics for the mission were straightforward. Maintain formation with the bombers. Stay close.
Engage enemy fighters only if they attack the bombers or your formation.
The primary
mission was bomber protection, not fighter sweeps.
Bring the bombers home.
Colonel Blakesley would lead the mission. His call sign was horseback. He
briefed the fuel management sequence again, emphasized it, repeated it, made sure every pilot understood. Run your fuselage tank on takeoff and climb. Switch to drop tanks at 10,000 foot over the channel. Burn them completely before you reach the combat area.
Drop the tanks, whether they are empty or not, before engaging enemy fighters.
Fight on wing fuel only. If you do not follow the sequence exactly, you will die over Germany. At 0645, the pilots walked out to their aircraft. Wickbacher watched Gentile do his pre-flight inspection, check the control surfaces, the
landing gear, the drop tanks, the gun bays, everything normal.
Gentile climbed into the cockpit. Wetbacker helped him strap in, checked his parachute harness, plugged in his radio and oxygen connections. Gentile's Mustang bore the name Shangri-La painted on the nose. It would become one of the most famous P-51s of the war. At 0700 hours, the first Mustang engine started.
The Merlin had a distinctive sound, a deep-throated roar that made the ground
shake. One after another, engines came to life.
The noise was overwhelming.
Wickbacher stood on the flight line and watched the Mustangs taxi toward the runway. They looked sleek and deadly.
Silver aluminum gleaming in the morning sun, drop tanks hanging heavy under the wings.
They looked like the future of fighter aviation. Wickbacher hoped they were. Blakesley led the takeoff. His Mustang lifted off at 0720 and climbed into the gray English sky.
The rest of the group followed, aircraft launching in pairs, forming up into flights and squadrons. Within minutes, Mustangs were airborne, climbing toward their rendezvous point with the bomber stream over the North Sea. What happened in the next 8 hours would change the air war
Over Europe forever. Captain Dominic Gentile had never been to Berlin.
None of the 4th Fighter Group pilots had. Berlin was the forbidden city, the target that was too far, too dangerous, too heavily defended.
American bombers
Had tried to reach it in daylight and failed.
The losses were too high. The escorts could not go that far. Berlin
was supposed to be untouchable. Today, that would change. The bomber stream appeared over the North Sea at 0815. Hundreds of aircraft, miles of sky filled with B-17S and B-24S flying in.
Tight combat boxes. Each box contained 18 to 21 bombers stacked vertically and horizontally to maximize defensive firepower.
From a distance, they looked like a massive armada, organized and
powerful.
Up close, you could see the individual aircraft, the names painted on their noses, the mission markings, the patches in the aluminum skin from previous battles.
These aircraft had been to Germany before. Many had barely survived. They were going back.
Gentile joined the bomber stream over Holland.
The Mustangs slotted into escort
positions, flights of 4 aircraft above and beside the bomber formations.
The tactics were simple. Stay close. Watch for enemy fighters. Protect the bombers at all costs. The Luftwaffe would come. Everyone knew it. The question was when and where and how many.
The fuel situation was working as planned.
Gentile burned his fuselage tank during climb out. Switched to drop tanks over the channel and watched the fuel gauge carefully as he flew east. The drop tanks fed normally.
No leaks, no pressure problems. So far, everything was perfect, but perfection in combat
never lasted.
The first German fighters appeared at 0930, 50 miles west of Hanover.
Bf-109s, multiple squadrons, maybe 40 aircraft. They dove on the bomber formations from
25,000 feet. Standard German tactics, high-speed slashing attacks, fire and breakaway before the defensive guns could track effective. The formation leaders called out the bandits.
The Mustang pilots climbed to intercept.
Gentile pushed his throttle forward and felt the Merlin respond instantly.
The
Mustang accelerated like nothing he had ever flown. Within seconds, he was at combat speed, closing on the German
fighters.
The engagement lasted several minutes.
The Bf-109s made their attack runs on the bombers. Several B-7s took hits.
One started smoking, fell out of formation, tried to make it home alone.
It would not make it. The Mustangs tore into the German formation. Gentile got shots at a 109 climbing away from a bomber.
The German fighter rolled and
dove away. Gentile did not follow.
His job was to stay with the bombers.
The 109s broke off. Too many Mustangs. Too aggressive. The Germans climbed away and regrouped. They would try again later. Gentile checked his fuel. The drop tanks were almost empty.
He switched back to wing tanks, pulled the emergency release handle, felt the tanks separate and fall
away.
The Mustang felt lighter immediately, cleaner, faster.
He was fighting on internal fuel. Now, everything from here on would be measured in minutes and gallons. At 1,000 hours, the bomber stream crossed into the Berlin defense zone. The flak started immediately. Black Puff's 88mm anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. The flak batteries knew the altitude and airspeed of the formations. They could put a box barrage exactly where the bombers would be. The only defense was to fly through it and hope. Gentile saw a B-7 take a direct hit. The entire nose section disintegrated.
The bomber fell away spinning, pieces of aircraft and crew tumbling through the air.
Nobody got out. Berlin appeared ahead through the haze. Gentile had seen London from the air many times. Berlin looked different, bigger, more spread out, industrial.
The city stretched for miles in every direction.
Factories, rail yards, residential areas, government buildings. This was the heart of Nazi Germany. This
was the place no American fighter was supposed to reach, and now Mustangs were flying over it at 26,000 feet. The bombers
began their bomb runs.
The lead groups opened their bomb bay doors, lined up on their targets, flew straight and level, while the bombarders took aim. This was the most dangerous part of any mission.
The aircraft could not maneuver during the bomb run.
They were completely vulnerable to flak and fighters.
The bombarders called out their adjustments.
Left, right, steady, bombs away.
The B-7s lurched upward as tons of high explosive fell toward the city below. The Luftwaffe hit the formation with everything they had. Over 100 German fighters attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. Focke-Wulf 190s, Bf 109s, Me-210 twin-engine destroyers. They came in fast and aggressive, pressing their attacks despite the Mustang cover. Several bombers went down. Others took heavy damage. The Mustangs engaged the German fighters wherever they could, breaking up attacks, forcing the enemy to fight defensively instead of focusing on the bombers. The bomber stream turned for home at 10:40. The surviving aircraft closed up their formations. The gaps where lost bombers had been painfully obvious. Behind them, Berlin burned, smoke rose thousands of feet into the air. The mission had hit its targets, but the cost was high. The flight back to England was a running battle. German fighters pursued the bomber stream across Germany, hitting damaged stragglers, trying to bring down more bombers before they reached the relative safety of Allied fighter range. The Mustang pilots stayed with their charges, fighting off attacks, conserving fuel, watching their gauges tick down toward empty. At 1,200 hours, the bomber stream crossed the Dutch coast, heading west. The German fighters broke off. They were at the limit of their fuel range. The bombers and Mustangs continued alone over the North Sea. Gentile's fuel gauge showed enough to make it home, barely. The 4th Fighter Group landed at Debon between 12:45 and 1300 hours. Gentile touched down with fuel to spare. He taxied to his parking spot, shut down the engine, sat in the cockpit for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. He had just flown to Berlin and back. He had fought German fighters over the Nazi capital. He had protected bombers deeper into Germany than anyone thought possible, and he was still alive. Webercher was waiting at the aircraft when Gentile climbed out. The crew chief said nothing. He just checked over the Mustang, looking for damage, counting the holes. A few hits in the wings, nothing critical. Gentile watched Wickbacher work and realized that the crew chief had believed in the aircraft. The fuel calculations, the drop tanks, the range extension, all of it. Wickbacher had known this would work. Now everyone else would too. What neither of them realized was that the mission they had just completed would break the Luftwaffe's will to fight. The Germans had known American bombers were coming to Berlin. They always knew. Their radar network tracked every formation from takeoff. They scrambled fighters, positioned flak batteries, prepared for the attack. What they did not expect was American fighters over Berlin, single-engine fighters flying 600 miles from England, fighting at full combat effectiveness. That should not have been possible. Everyone knew single-engine fighters did not have that kind of range. The Luftwaffe had studied American aircraft. They knew the P-47s could not reach Berlin. They knew the P-38s were rare and had problems. They knew the new P-51s existed, but assumed they had the same limitations as other fighters. Drop tanks could only do so much. The physics did not work. Except the physics did work. The Mustang with 108-gallon drop tanks could fly 750 miles. Combat radius. Berlin was 600 m from England. The Mustang could reach it, fight for 30 minutes over the target and return to base with fuel to spare. The Germans did not believe this until they saw it with their own eyes. Ober Adolf Gand commanded Luftwaffe fighter operations in Western Europe. He was 32 years old, one of Germany's top aces, with over 90 confirmed victories. He had been fighting Allied aircraft since 1940. He knew their capabilities intimately. When initial reports came in about American P-51 Mustangs over Berlin, Gallant dismissed them as errors. Probably P-38s misidentified. Possibly a few aircraft that wandered off course and stumbled over Berlin accidentally. No way were American fighters flying there deliberately on escort missions. Then more reports came in. Multiple sightings, dozens of American fighters engaging German interceptors aggressively, staying with bomber formations for extended periods. Galland reviewed the intelligence carefully. The reports were consistent. Mustangs were definitely over Berlin. If the reports were accurate, this changed everything. But Galland needed confirmation. He needed to see it himself.
On March 6, Galland and another German general flew to intercept the next American bomber raid.
They wanted to see these American fighters for themselves. They wanted to verify that Allied aircraft could really reach Berlin. They assumed they would find confused enemy pilots flying lost aircraft. They were wrong. The Americans found them first.
P-51 Mustangs dub on Galland and the other general from above.
The Mustangs
were fast, aggressive, and clearly operating at full combat capability.
These were not lost aircraft wandering aimlessly over Germany. These were American fighters on a planned escort mission hunting German interceptors. Galland and the other general split up and tried to evade. The Mustangs pursued.
The other general's aircraft
was shot down. Galland escaped by firing his guns forward, creating a cloud of gun smoke and spent brass that fooled the pursuing Mustangs into thinking they were being attacked from behind. They broke off. Galland escaped. The other general did not.
Both were shaken. The Americans really could reach Berlin. This was not an aberration.
This was the new reality. Galland reported to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring immediately. Göring commanded the entire Luftwaffe. He was Hitler's second in command.
He had been a fighter pilot in World War I, a skilled commander, a political survivor. But by 1944, he was out of touch with the actual situation in the air war.
He believed the Luftwaffe was still winning.
He believed American losses were unsustainable. He believed German fighters controlled the skies over the Reich.
Galland's report shattered those beliefs.
According to official United States Air Force Europe interrogation summaries, when Göring learned that American single-engine fighters had escorted bombers to Berlin, he stated that when fighters actually appeared over Berlin for the first time, he knew that the eventual results would be tragic for Germany.
Long-range fighters
were the most decisive factor in the outcome of the air war.
The Mustang's capability came as a complete surprise to him. Göring was right. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang as a long-range escort
fighter fundamentally changed the strategic situation. For 18 months, the Luftwaffe had successfully defended
German airspace by attacking unescorted bombers. German fighters waited until Allied escorts reached their fuel limits and turned back.
Then they hit the bombers without opposition.
It worked perfectly. American losses were staggering. But now American fighters could escort the bombers anywhere. There was nowhere in Germany the Luftwaffe could hide.
Every target was vulnerable. Every city could be bombed with fighter protection.
The defense of the Reich had failed. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots was severe.
For 3 years, they had owned the sky in
defensive operations.
They knew they could outfight bombers. They knew they could defeat fighter escorts by forcing
them to turn back. That confidence was breaking down.
Pilots who used to press attacks were becoming hesitant.
They
were not sure anymore if American fighters would leave or stay.
They were not sure if engaging the escorts would work or get them killed. The Luftwaffe was losing its aggressive edge. German pilots tried to adapt. Some avoided the Mustangs entirely and only attacked bombers when escorts were absent. But the escorts were never absent anymore. The P-51 stayed with the bombers all the way to target and all the way home.
There were no gaps in coverage.
Other
German pilots became more aggressive, closing to shorter ranges, taking more risks, trying to shoot down bombers
before the escorts could intercept.
But increased aggression without tactical advantage just meant dying faster. Several experienced German aces were killed in March and April trying tactics that had worked perfectly in 1943.
The fundamental problem for the Luftwaffe was that they were fighting an enemy they could not counter.
The P-51 was faster
than German fighters at altitude.
It had longer range. It was more heavily armed.
It had better high-altitude performance.
And it was being produced in massive numbers.
By April 1944, most of the 8th Air Force fighter groups were flying Mustangs. Hundreds of them. They were everywhere all the time, escorting every mission. The Germans could not shoot them all down. They could not avoid them. They could not outfight them. The Luftwaffe was being worn down mission by mission, day by day, until there was nothing left. In March 1944,
the 8th Air Force lost 64 fighters over Germany.
The Luftwaffe lost almost 300 fighters in the same period, many to Mustangs.
In April, the ratio got worse.
In May, worse still. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing 2 to 3 fighters for every American fighter shot down.
The kill ratio had reversed
completely.
The hunters had become the hunted.
On June 6, 1944, the Allies invaded Normandy. Over 15,000 Allied aircraft supported the invasion. The Luftwaffe sent fewer than 100 fighters to contest it.
They had lost so many aircraft and pilots in the previous 3 months that they could not mount an
effective defense. Allied air superiority was total. American and British fighters flew over the invasion beaches unopposed.
German ground forces fought without air support, their positions bombed and strafed. The Normandy invasion succeeded in part because the Luftwaffe had been destroyed in the air war over
Germany.
The P-51 Mustang was the aircraft that destroyed it.
The modification that made this possible was remarkably simple.
The P-51B already had good range with its internal fuel, 184 gallons in the wings, 85 gallons in the fuselage tank.
But it was the addition of the 108 gallons external drop tanks that changed everything. Those tanks were not made of metal, they were made of paper, craft paper laminated, with resort glue formed over wooden molds hardened into cylindrical shapes 100 in long. They looked crude, they looked like something you would ship products in, not something you would hang on a fighter aircraft, but they worked. The paper tanks were
manufactured in England by companies that normally made cardboard boxes and industrial packaging.
They were cheap to
produce, light, and weight, and did not require scarce strategic metals.
They could hold fuel for 5 to 6 hours before
the glue began to break down and the tanks started leaking.
That was long enough for a mission to Berlin and back. The tanks were single-use.
Once dropped, they were gone.
But that was acceptable.
They cost almost nothing to make. American factories could produce them by the thousands. The installation was straightforward.
Each tank mounted on a bomb rack under the wing.
Fuel lines connected to the main fuel system.
A pressure line ensured the fuel would flow at altitude.
A manual release handle in the cockpit allowed the pilot to jettison the tanks when empty.
The entire system added minimal weight and drag when the tanks were empty and about to be dropped.
When full, the tanks
degraded performance slightly, but the extended range made that trade-off worthwhile.
The development of the paper
drop tank was not dramatic. No brilliant engineer had a breakthrough insight. No laboratory discovered new technology. It was a simple solution to a simple problem. Fighters needed more fuel.
Metal tanks were in short supply.
Paper was available.
Someone tried making a tank out of paper and it worked.
That was all.
But that simple solution helped
win the war. The credit for the Mustang's success is usually given to the pilots. They were the ones who flew the
missions, fought the battles, brought the bombers home, and they deserve that credit. But the pilots could not have done their job without the crew chiefs who maintained the aircraft, the engineers who designed the fuel systems, the factory workers who built the drop tanks, the supply sergeants who made sure everything was available when needed.
The Mustang was a system, not just an airplane.
Every part of that system had to work perfectly every time or people died.
Staff Sergeant Leesbacher worked on P-51 Mustangs from February 1944 until the end of the war. He maintained engines, repaired battle damage, loaded ammunition, installed drop tanks. He did pre-flight inspections at 0500 hours and post-flight maintenance until midnight. He worked through rain, cold, mud, and exhaustion. He never flew a combat mission. He never shot down an enemy aircraft. His name appears in
maintenance logs and unit rosters, but rarely in history books. But he kept the aircraft flying, and that made everything
else possible. Wettbacher maintained aircraft for multiple pilots over the course of the war. He was crew chief for Lieutenant Joseph Higgins, whose P-51B minor Kleiner became famous in the squadron. He worked on Colonel Everett Stewart's Sunny Vade after Stewart took command of the 4th Fighter Group in February 1945.
Vekbacher participated in Operation Frantic II, the Russia shuttle mission in June and July 1944, maintaining aircraft at forward bases thousands of miles from England.
He was promoted to Staff Sergeant on April 1, 1943 and served with the 4th Fighter Group until August 26, 1945. Captain Dominic Gentile became one of the most famous American fighter pilots of World War II. The March 4 mission was just the beginning. Weather had disrupted that first attempt. Only 31 bombers from the 13th Combat Wing actually reached Berlin that day due to a snowstorm. But the Mustangs had proven they could make the trip. That was enough. 2 days later on, March 6, the weather cleared. The 8th Air Force launched the first major daylight bombing raid on Berlin. 660 bombers took off from England, escorted by over 150 P-51 Mustangs. This was the mission that truly demonstrated American air power over the German capital. Colonel Blakesley led the 4th Fighter Group again. The bombers hit their targets. The Mustangs engaged German fighters across the Berlin defense zone. The 4th Fighter Group claimed 13 victories that day. American losses were acceptable. The mission was a complete success. But March 8 was Gentile's Day. The 8th Air Force launched another massive raid on Berlin. Over 600 bombers again escorted by Mustangs all the way to the target. Gentile was leading a section of fighters from the 336th Squadron when he spotted a flight of bombers under attack by approximately 50 enemy fighters. The odds were overwhelming. Gentile had only his wingman, John Godfrey, for support. Any sane pilot would have called for help and waited for reinforcements. Gentile attacked immediately. He dove into the German formation without hesitation. The Bf-109 scattered, surprised by the aggressive American fighters cutting through their attack formation. Gentile got his gunite on the first 109. He fired. The German fighter exploded. Gentile reversed hard, looking for the next target. Another 109 crossed in front of him. Gentile fired again. Hits sparkled along the fuselage and wing. The German fighter rolled inverted and fell away smoking. The fight turned into a swirling dogfight over Berlin. Gentile and Godfrey working together, covering each other, executing the tactics they had perfected over months of combat. Whoever saw a target first took the lead. The other covered his six. It was fluid, aggressive, and devastatingly effective. Gentile got his gun sight on a third 109, close range, maybe 200 feet. He pressed the trigger. The Mustang's 6 guns hammered. The 109 came apart in midair. Pieces of aircraft tumbled past Gentile's canopy. 3 confirmed kills in one mission, plus 1 shared with Godfrey. The Distinguished Service Cross citation would later read that Captain Gentile, with only his wingman as support and without regard to the overwhelming odds against him, immediately attacked the enemy formation, and by extremely courageous flying and skillful gunnery, destroyed 3 enemy planes. His actions broke up the attack on the bombers and saved American lives. General Dwight Eisenhower would personally award Gentile the Distinguished Service Cross. At a ceremony at Debden on April 11, Eisenhower called Gentile a one-man air force. The press loved him. Reporters followed him everywhere. His photograph appeared in newspapers across America. He was becoming the face of American fighter aviation in Europe, and his Mustang Shangri-La with its distinctive markings became one of the most recognizable aircraft of the war. He and his wingman John Godfrey formed the most effective fighter team in the 8th Air Force. Hermann Goering reportedly called them the Debden gangsters and swore he would trade 2 squadrons for their capture. By April 1944, Gentile had become the leading American ace in Europe with over 27 confirmed victories. On April 13, reporters gathered at Debden to film Gentile landing. After what was supposed to be his final combat mission before rotation home, Gentile decided to demonstrate the Mustang's maneuverability with a low-level aerobatic display. He came in too low. On a buzz job and crash-landed Shangri-La on the airfield, Gentile emerged unscathed, but the aircraft was destroyed.
Colonel Blakesley, who had established a strict rule that anyone who tampered with his plane would be grounded and sent home immediately, promptly grounded Gentile. Gentile returned to the United States to participate in a war bond tour. His final record stood at 19.83 aerial victories, 6 ground kills, and 3 damaged. After the war, Gentile remained in the Air Force as a test pilot at Wright Field and later as a training officer. On January 28, 1951, the 30-year-old Don Gentile was killed when his T-33 trainer crashed in Forestville, Maryland. He left behind his wife Isabella and 3 young sons.
He was interred with full military honors at St. Joseph Cemetery in Lockbourne, Ohio. A street at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base bears his name in tribute.
Colonel Donald Blakesley flew over 500 combat missions between 1941 and 1944, accumulating more than 1,000 combat hours, the most of any American fighter pilot in World War II. He led the 4th Fighter Group through some of the most intense battles of the air war. He personally commanded the first shuttle mission to Russia in June 1944, a 1,500-mile flight that required 19 navigation charts crammed into his cockpit. He executed the mission flawlessly, and upon returning to Debden, he was hailed as a hero. In September 1944, after more than 3 years of continuous combat, Blakesley was ordered home for leave. He flew 3 additional missions in October. On October 30th, General Kepner grounded him. The 8th Air Force had suffered too many losses among its seasoned leaders that month and could not afford to lose Blakesley as well. Blakesley was devastated but returned to the United States in November. By the war's end, the 4th Fighter Group held the highest kill count of any American fighter group in Europe, having destroyed 1,016 German aircraft. Blakesley achieved this record through relentless, aggressive leadership. He retired from the Air Force in 1965 at the rank of colonel, passed away on September 3, 2008, at the age of 90, and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. That is how wars are truly won, not solely through brilliant generals or advanced technology, but through the efforts of thousands of people performing their roles flawlessly under extreme pressure. The pilots who flew into the most dangerous skies in the world each day. The crew chiefs who maintained aircraft through the night so pilots could take off at dawn.
The engineers who solved fuel range problems using ingenuity, paper, and glue.
The factory workers who produced drop tanks by the thousands. Each person played their part, and together, they changed history. The P-51 Mustang over Berlin was not just about a single aircraft or one mission. It represented a system that functioned seamlessly, a system built by people who identified a problem, found a solution, and made it work.
Official histories often credit the Mustang's Merlin engine and its aerodynamic design.
Those elements were important, but insufficient by themselves. The real breakthrough was the drop tank, a simple paper cylinder that provided American fighters the range to escort bombers anywhere in Europe. That tank was not developed in a laboratory, nor was it the result of years of research. It was a practical solution to an urgent problem, crafted by ordinary people using available materials, and it worked. Goering was correct when he said the Mustang decided the war, but it was not solely the aircraft. It was the combination of factors that made it effective: the range, the firepower, the reliability, the crew chiefs who kept it operational, the pilots who pushed it to its limits, and the paper drop tanks that extended its reach beyond what anyone had thought possible. All of it together, functioning as a system, overwhelmed the Luftwaffe through persistence, volume, and superior logistics.
Germany could not compete.
They had excellent aircraft and skilled pilots, but they lacked the industrial base, training pipeline, and fuel resources to sustain the fight. The Americans had all of those, and that made the decisive difference. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. It helps us reach more people who value these forgotten chapters of history. Subscribe to stay connected with more untold stories from World War II, and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans the globe: history students, veterans, aviation enthusiasts, and families preserving memories.
You are part of something meaningful here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. These stories matter. These people mattered, and they deserve to be honored.